Video B4. Here we look at the total benefit gained by buyers and sellers when they make purchases and sell goods and services. Let's start on the buyer's side. And to do this, we're going to want to look at the demand curve as our place to begin. So if we start with our usual price and quantity axes, let's show a downward sloping demand curve as usual and make sure that it starts at the axis. That will become important in a little bit and we'll see why. Now, the downward sloping demand curve we think of as meaning that consumers choose to buy less as the price decreases. But another way of looking at it is to say that the value or the utility that we get from additional purchases of goods declines as we have more and more of those goods, or as we move to those buyers for whom the good is not worth as much as some other consumers. So if we look at it that way, we can say that demand is a measure of the marginal utility or the marginal benefit that is gained when purchases are made. Let's say that the consumer is charged a price P0. Well, we know that at that price, if we go over to the demand curve, we can see how much is purchased. And we'll label that as the price, as the amount Q0. So we have two things here. The consumer is gaining value from all of the purchases that they've made Q0, but they had to give up a total amount P0 times Q0 in order to gain those goods or services that they've purchased. So the difference of that, which I label by the area A, is the net benefit to them. So consumer surplus equals the net benefit to consumers or buyers when a purchase is made. Now let's turn our attention to the sellers. We'll start with our usual framework, price and quantity. And here, to represent the costs faced by the sellers in producing their goods, we introduce the supply curve. Now let's assume that, just as with the buyers, the sellers are faced with a market price. We'll call it P0. Using that market price, we can go over to the supply curve and then drop down to the quantity axis. And doing that, we get a quantity Q0 that the sellers offer for sale and sell to the buyers. Now that we've got this part, we can think again about the two consequences for the sellers. First of all, they've sold their product and receive a revenue P0 times Q0. They also, though, incur costs in producing the good. Let's put an area B and an area C into our graph here. What we can say is that the total revenue that is received by the sellers is equal to area B plus C. The cost, however, to the sellers is equal to just area C. Now that cost comes from identifying the supply curve as being equal to the cost of producing one more good, the marginal cost. And we total that up over everything from no production out to a quantity Q0, and that's how we get the total cost of C. Well, the difference between revenue and cost is the benefit to the producers, what we mean by producer surplus. So what we conclude then is that the net benefit, that is the producer surplus to sellers, equals this area B plus C minus C, or just the area B. Let's put it all together now, and in doing that, we're going to see what we mean by total surplus, the gains to everybody participating in the market here. So if I put it together, we're going to again use our usual framework, price and quantity, and now I'm going to introduce both a supply curve and a demand curve. So let's have demand here. Supply, I'm going to start with a price P0 that would result from a competitive market, and the quantity Q0 that would result from that competitive market. And now let me introduce those areas that we talked about before. A, which was the consumer surplus, B, which was the producer surplus, and C, which was the costs to the producers. Total surplus now is just consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and that's going to be equal to area A plus area B. Now that we have tools for understanding the total benefits gained by consumers and producers in a marketplace, I want to compare the outcomes we get when there is market power of monopoly compared to the situation of competition, which we used in the previous slide. So for monopoly, we're again going to start with our usual framework, price and quantity. Nothing has changed about our demand or marginal benefits, and we're also going to introduce our supply curve as being the marginal costs to the producer. And now the difference is that the monopoly can choose the price, and it chooses a price above what would result in competition. So let's introduce that price P0, PM for the monopolist, and going across to the demand curve, that tells us how much is purchased on the demand side, and we'll label that QM for the amount purchased by the consumer. Now we can introduce the different surpluses. The consumer surplus is going to be the area A above the price line but below the marginal benefits that are enjoyed by the consumer. So our consumer surplus is going to be area A. Our producer surplus is going to be the difference between the revenue, PM times QM, minus the costs, the area underneath the cost curve. So if I introduce an area B and an area C, the producer surplus is going to be just area B. And the total surplus of both of these is, of course, going to be area A plus area B. To compare what happens in monopoly to competition, let's review what happened in competition. We'll start with price, quantity. We'll use the same demand curve, the same supply curve we've been working with, and the outcome that we get with competition is that the intersection of supply and demand determines a market price and a market quantity. I'll label these as P sub C and Q sub C to be clear that we're talking about the competitive outcome. Let's also add in the outcome with monopoly, P sub M, that chosen by the monopolist. We again go over to the demand curve and drop down to see the amount purchased at that price. Now let's do some labeling. All right. We have an area A, the same as the consumer surplus in monopoly. Now I have two pieces for the area B. I'm going to label that B1 and B2, our area C, and then I'm also going to label this area D1 and area D2. Let's summarize what we have. That in competition, we have consumer surplus equals area A plus B1 plus D1. Our producer surplus is area B2 plus area D2. And if I put that all together, my total surplus of both of those is area A plus, I'm going to call B1 plus B2 just area B, because that's the same as we had on the left side of the screen. And I'm going to call area D1 and D2 just area D. So now what we see, it's this area D is new. That's an extra gain, an additional surplus that we gain with perfect competition compared to monopoly. Let's move back to the graph of monopoly now and look at that. We can add that area D back into our original graph, and we can think about what that means. That area D represents consumers who are no longer purchasing the good, and it's also production that is not happening by the business. We've identified that as an additional economic gain that could be enjoyed by society were it to happen. We label that D, thinking about it in the context of monopoly. We label that as deadweight loss. And one way to think about deadweight loss is that it is the economic surplus that is not gained or not enjoyed when we have the wrong choice on the amount that is produced in society.